Alright, let's sleep. Pull the blankets up to your chin. Fluff your pillow. Turn off your phone and let the darkness settle around you like a soft, warm cloak. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time to the end of the 11th century, a world of knights and pilgrims, of swords and crosses, of a journey so long and so perilous that most of those who set out never returned. We're going to tell the story of the Siege of Antioch, 8 months of hunger, betrayal, visions, and blood that would decide the fate of the First Crusade. But before we get to the siege, we need to understand the world that produced it, a world of faith and fear, of empires rising and falling, of a pope who called for a holy war and a king who answered the call. The call. It was November 27, 1095. The place was Clermont, in central France. A crowd of thousands had gathered in a field outside the city walls, knights, peasants, priests, and pilgrims, come from all over Europe to hear the words of Pope Urban II. The Pope stood on a raised platform, his voice carrying across the crowd, and he spoke of something that would change the world. He spoke of Jerusalem, the holy city, the city where Jesus had walked, where he had died, where he had risen. He spoke of the Muslims who now held it, who defiled the holy places, who oppressed the Christian pilgrims who dared to visit. He spoke of the Byzantine Empire, the great Christian kingdom to the east, which was being overrun by the Seljuk Turks. He spoke of the need for a holy war, a crusade, to liberate the Holy Land and restore it to Christian rule. And then he spoke the words that would echo through history, God wills it. The crowd erupted. They shouted it back at him, God wills it. God wills it. Men wept, men prayed, men fell to their knees. And thousands of them, from the humblest peasant to the mightiest knight, took a vow to go to the Holy Land, to fight for God, and to win back Jerusalem. The First Crusade had begun. The journey. It took months for the Crusaders to gather and prepare. They came from all over Europe, from France, from Germany, from Italy, from the Low Countries. They were a motley army, knights in shining armor, peasants with nothing but a staff and a cross, women and children, priests and monks. They were not a professional army, they were a mob, a pilgrimage, a holy adventure. And they marched. They marched across Europe, through the Balkans, through the Byzantine Empire, into Asia Minor. They suffered terrible hardships, hunger, disease, the attacks of hostile tribes. Thousands died along the way. But they kept marching. By the autumn of 1097, the Crusaders had reached the city of Antioch, in northern Syria. It was a great city, one of the oldest and most important in the world. It had been founded by the Greeks, conquered by the Romans, and held by the Byzantines for centuries. It had been the seat of one of the 5 great patriarchates of the Christian Church. It was also, for the last 100 years, under Muslim rule. And it was, from a military standpoint, virtually impregnable. The Crusaders knew that they could not simply pass by Antioch. The city lay on their route to Jerusalem, and its garrison could attack their supply lines, their rear, their flanks. They had to take it. But how? The city. Antioch was a fortress. It was built on the banks of the Orontes River, about 12 miles from the coast, surrounded by high walls that had been built by the Byzantines in the 10th century. The walls were so thick and so strong that they could withstand any siege engine the Crusaders could bring. The city was also defended by a massive citadel, perched on a mountain peak, which overlooked the entire city and could hold out indefinitely. The city's garrison was commanded by Yaghi Siyan, an experienced Turkish governor who had been appointed by the Seljuk Sultan. He was a shrewd, capable, and determined defender. He had stockpiled food and water for a long siege, and he had sent messages to the surrounding Muslim states, asking for reinforcements. The Crusaders arrived outside the walls of Antioch on October 20, 1097. They looked up at the massive walls, the towering citadel, the seemingly impregnable fortifications. And they must have felt a chill of despair. But they had no choice. They had to take the city. The siege begins. The Crusaders set up their camp outside the walls of Antioch. They were led by a collection of powerful nobles: Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy; Raymond of Toulouse, a wealthy and devout count from the south of France; Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious and valiant duke from the German lands; and Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, a bishop who served as the spiritual leader of the crusade. Each of these leaders commanded a section of the blockading lines. The siege was not a tight, complete encirclement. The city was too large, and the crusaders did not have enough men. They were perhaps 30,000 strong, but many of them were not soldiers. They were pilgrims, women, children, the elderly. The fighting men, the knights and men-at-arms, numbered perhaps 10,000. It was not enough. The defenders of Antioch, by contrast, were battle-hardened Turkish troops, well supplied and well entrenched. They had the advantage of height, of fortification, of knowing the terrain. They also had the support of the local population, who were Muslim and hostile to the Christian invaders. The siege settled into a stalemate. The crusaders could not breach the walls, and the defenders could not break out. Both sides waited, the crusaders for a miracle, the defenders for reinforcements. But the crusaders were running out of food. The hunger. It was a cold, wet autumn, and the winter that followed was brutal. The crusaders had stripped the surrounding countryside of food, and there was nothing left to forage. They had to send out foraging parties, often far from the camp, which were vulnerable to ambush. Men began to desert. The hunger was terrible. The crusaders ate their horses. They ate their mules, their donkeys, their dogs. They ate the leather of their shoes, boiled into a thin soup. They ate the bark of trees, the roots of plants, anything that could sustain life. And then, according to the chroniclers, they ate something worse. The stories are horrifying. Men, driven mad by hunger, began to eat the bodies of their dead comrades. The chronicles record that the bodies of the dead were cut into pieces and boiled, and they were eaten. It is a detail that has haunted historians for centuries, but it is a detail that reveals the depths of desperation that the crusaders reached. One chronicler, Albert of Aachen, wrote that during the winter of 1097–1098, the famine was so great that they ate the flesh of horses and asses, and the bodies of their dead companions were devoured. It was not just hunger, it was a wholesale collapse of civilization. The men who had come to fight for God were reduced to animals. The defenders of Antioch, by contrast, were well fed. They could see the suffering of the crusaders from the walls, and they mocked them. They shouted insults, they threw stones, and they laughed at the starving Christians below. But the crusaders did not give up. They prayed. They marched in processions around the city walls, carrying crosses and relics, begging God to deliver them. They confessed their sins, they fasted, they did penance. And they waited for the miracle that would save them. The betrayal. The miracle came, but not in the way they expected. It came not from heaven, but from the treachery of a man inside the city. Bohemond of Taranto was a cunning and ambitious leader. He was also a pragmatist. He knew that the siege could not be won by force alone, it would have to be won by guile. So he set about finding a way inside the city. He made contact with a man named Firouz, an Armenian Christian who had been forced to convert to Islam and was now serving as a guard on one of the city's towers. Firouz was bitter and resentful. He had been humiliated by his Turkish masters, and he was willing to betray them. The negotiations were secret and delicate. Bohemond and Firouz communicated through messengers, often at night, always in the shadows. They agreed on a price. Firouz would be paid handsomely for his betrayal, and they agreed on a plan. On a certain night, Firouz would open the gate of his tower, and the crusaders would enter the city. The plan was risky. If it failed, Firouz would be executed, and the crusaders would lose their best chance at taking the city. If it succeeded, Antioch would fall. On the night of June 2, 1098, the plan was put into action. The crusaders gathered in silence outside the walls. Bohemond led a small group of knights to the tower where Firouz was stationed. Firouz lowered a rope ladder, and the knights climbed up, one by one, into the tower. They seized control of the gate, threw it open, and the Crusader army poured into the city dock. The attack was a complete surprise. The defenders were caught off guard, and they panicked. Some fought back, but they were overwhelmed. The Crusaders swept through the streets, killing everyone they encountered, soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children. The massacre was brutal and indiscriminate. The chroniclers record that the streets ran with blood, that the bodies of the dead were piled up like firewood, that the city was a charnel house dock. Yaghi Siyan, the governor, fled the city in terror. He was pursued by the Crusaders, and he was killed, some say by a Crusader's sword, others say he fell from his horse and was trampled to death. His body was found later, mutilated and unrecognizable. But the victory was not complete. The citadel, the massive fortress on the mountain peak, was still held by a Turkish garrison. The defenders had retreated there, and they were determined to hold out until reinforcements arrived. And reinforcements were coming. The reinforcements. Kerbogha, the Albert of Mosul, was the most powerful Muslim ruler in the region. He had been gathering an army for months, and now he was marching to relieve Antioch. His force was enormous, perhaps 40,000 men, maybe more. He had brought together troops from all over the Muslim world, Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Persians. It was the largest army that the Crusaders had ever faced. Kerbogha arrived outside the walls of Antioch on June 4, just 2 days after the Crusaders had taken the city. He was furious. He had expected to find the city still in Muslim hands. Instead, he found it occupied by the Christians. He set up his camp and began to prepare for a siege, not a siege of the city, but a siege of the Crusaders, who were now trapped inside Antioch. The situation was desperate. The Crusaders had captured the city, but they were now besieged in turn. They had food for only a few days. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and exhausted. The citadel, still held by the Turks, was a constant threat. And Kerbogha's army was vast and well supplied. The Crusaders began to lose hope. Men began to desert again. Some slipped out of the city at night, hoping to escape the coming disaster. Among the deserters was Stephen of Blois, a powerful nobleman who had been one of the leaders of the crusade. He slipped away with a small group of followers, leaving the Crusaders to their fate. Stephen's desertion would have consequences far beyond his own shame. He made his way to the coast, where he encountered the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, who was leading a relief force to Antioch. Stephen told the emperor that the crusade was lost, that the city had fallen, and that everyone was dead. The emperor, believing Stephen's report, turned back. He abandoned the Crusaders to their fate. The Crusaders, meanwhile, were desperate. They had no food. They had no hope. They had only their faith. The vision. On June 10, a peasant named Peter Bartholomew came forward with an extraordinary claim. He had had a vision, he said. Saint Andrew, the apostle, had appeared to him and told him that the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Jesus during the crucifixion, was buried beneath the floor of the church of St. Peter, inside the city. The Crusaders were skeptical. Peter Bartholomew was a nobody, a poor, illiterate peasant. Why would God choose him to reveal such a precious relic? But the Crusaders were also desperate. They needed a miracle, and they were willing to believe. On June 14, a group of Crusaders entered the church of St. Peter. Peter Bartholomew led them to a spot on the floor, and they began to dig. They dug through the earth, through the rubble, through the centuries of debris. And then, according to the chroniclers, they found it, a piece of iron, dark and rusted, shaped like a spearhead. Peter Bartholomew reached down, grasped it, and held it up for all to see. The crowd erupted. The Holy Lance. The weapon that had pierced the side of Christ. God had delivered them a sign. The Crusaders wept, they prayed, they thanked God for this miracle. The relic was carried in procession through the streets, and the morale of the army soared. But the skepticism remained. Many, including the papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy, doubted the authenticity of the relic. Adhemar had seen many false relics in his time, and he suspected that Peter Bartholomew was a fraud. But he also recognized the power of the relic to inspire the troops. He did not openly challenge it. The battle. On June 28, the Crusaders made a fateful decision. They would march out of the city and fight Kerbogha's army in the open field. It was a gamble, a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. They had no food left, they would starve if they stayed. They had to fight. The Crusader army, led by Bohemond and Raymond of Toulouse, marched out of the city gates. They formed into battle lines, with the Holy Lance carried at the front of the army, a symbol of God's favor. They were outnumbered, perhaps 20,000 Crusaders against 40,000 Muslims. The odds were against them. But the Crusaders had something that the Muslims did not: desperation. They knew that if they lost this battle, they would die, all of them. There would be no mercy, no quarter. They fought with a fury that their enemies could not match. The battle was fierce and chaotic. The Muslim cavalry charged, but the Crusader infantry held firm. The knights countercharged, and the Muslims were thrown back. The fighting went on for hours, back and forth, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. And then, something unexpected happened. The Muslim army began to waver. Kerbogha's allies, many of whom were forced to follow him, began to desert. They saw that the Crusaders were not going to break, and they decided to save themselves. The Muslim lines crumbled, and the Crusaders surged forward. Kerbogha's army fled. They abandoned their tents, their supplies, their baggage. The Crusaders pursued them, cutting them down as they ran. The victory was total. Kerbogha himself escaped, but his army was destroyed. The Crusaders had won an impossible victory. Against all odds, they had defeated the greatest Muslim army of the age. They had survived the siege, the hunger, the disease, and the despair. They had triumphed. The aftermath. The victory at Antioch was a turning point in the crusade. The Crusaders had secured their supply lines, their reinforcements, and their morale. They had proven that they could defeat the Muslims in open battle. And they had gained a powerful relic, the Holy Lance, that would inspire them in the months ahead. But the victory was not without its costs. The Crusaders had lost thousands of men during the siege, to hunger, to disease, to desertion. The survivors were exhausted, battered, and traumatized. Many of them would never return home. And there was still the matter of the Holy Lance. The relic had been a powerful symbol during the battle, but its authenticity remained in doubt. Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, never fully accepted it. And Peter Bartholomew, the visionary peasant who had found it, would soon face a trial by fire to prove his claims. The trial. Peter Bartholomew's credibility was questioned by many. The skeptics, led by Adhemar of Le Puy, demanded that Peter undergo a trial by fire, a medieval ordeal in which the accused would be tested by God. If Peter survived, his claims would be vindicated. If he died, he would be exposed as a fraud. Peter agreed. He would walk through a path of burning coals, carrying the Holy Lance, and if God protected him, he would be proven true. The trial was set for a day in late June. A large crowd gathered to watch. A path of burning coals was laid out, and Peter Bartholomew, carrying the Holy Lance, walked through it. He emerged on the other side, apparently unscathed. The crowd cheered. Peter's claims were vindicated. But the celebration was short-lived. Peter died a few days later, of his burns. The ordeal had been too much for him. His death cast a shadow over his claims, and the authenticity of the Holy Lance remained a subject of debate for centuries. The legacy. The Siege of Antioch was one of the most extraordinary events of the First Crusade. It was a story of faith and desperation, of betrayal and heroism, of hunger and miracles. It was a story of men who refused to give up, even when all hope seemed lost. And it was a story of the human capacity for belief, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Crusaders would go on to capture Jerusalem in 1099, fulfilling the promise they had made at Clermont. But the Siege of Antioch remained the crucible of the Crusade, the moment when the Crusaders were forged into a fighting force. The city of Antioch would become the capital of a Crusader state, the Principality of Antioch, which would endure for nearly 2 centuries. Bohemond of Taranto became its first prince, and his descendants would rule it for generations. But the siege also left a legacy of trauma. The Crusaders had seen things that no human being should see: hunger, death, the eating of human flesh. They had committed atrocities, massacring the population of Antioch. They had been changed by their experiences, hardened by their suffering. And the Muslims, too, had been changed. The victory at Antioch was a blow to Muslim prestige, a reminder that the Christians were a force to be reckoned with. The enmity between the two faiths, which had existed for centuries, was deepened and intensified. The characters. Let us take a moment to remember the people of the Siege of Antioch. There was Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman prince who had been cheated of his inheritance and who saw the crusade as a chance to carve out a kingdom of his own. He was cunning, ambitious, and ruthless, but he was also a brilliant leader, a man who could inspire loyalty in his followers. He was the architect of the betrayal that brought down the city, and he would become the first prince of Antioch. There was Raymond of Toulouse, the wealthy and devout count who was Bohemond's rival for leadership of the crusade. Raymond was a man of deep faith, who believed that God had called him to the Holy Land. He was also a man of pride, who resented Bohemond's success. The rivalry between Raymond and Bohemond would continue throughout the crusade, and it would shape the history of the Crusader states. There was Godfrey of Bouillon, the pious and valiant duke from the German lands. Godfrey was a man of simple faith, who believed that he was fighting for God. He would go on to become the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but he would die young, leaving behind a legacy of piety and courage. There was Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, the spiritual leader of the crusade. Adhemar was a man of learning, a bishop who had been chosen by the Pope to guide the crusade. He was a moderating influence on the Crusaders, a voice of reason in a world of chaos. He would die during the siege, his body buried in the church of St. Peter. There was Yaghi Siyan, the governor of Antioch, the defender of the city. Yaghi Siyan was a brave and capable commander, who had done everything he could to protect his city. He was betrayed by Firouz, the Armenian Christian who opened the gates, and he died in the chaos of the capture. His body was mutilated, his head displayed on a pike. There was Firouz, the betrayer, the man who had sold his city for gold. Firouz was a man of mixed loyalties, an Armenian Christian who had converted to Islam, a man who had been humiliated by his Turkish masters. He made a choice that would change the course of history, and he would be remembered as a traitor by both sides. There was Peter Bartholomew, the visionary peasant, the man who found the Holy Lance. Peter was a nobody, a poor, illiterate peasant who had no business leading the Crusaders. But he had a vision, and he believed in it with all his heart. He died for his belief, and his death would be a subject of debate for centuries. And there were the thousands of unnamed Crusaders, the knights, the peasants, the women, the children, who suffered and died during the siege. They were the ones who endured the hunger, the cold, the disease. They were the ones who kept the faith, even when all hope seemed lost. They were the ones who made the crusade possible. The lessons. What can we learn from the Siege of Antioch? First, the human capacity for endurance is astonishing. The Crusaders endured things that most of us cannot even imagine. They suffered hunger, cold, disease, and despair. They were betrayed, abandoned, and surrounded. And yet they did not give up. They kept fighting, kept believing, kept hoping. Their endurance is a testament to the power of the human spirit. Second, faith can move mountains, but it can also blind. The Crusaders believed, with all their hearts, that God was on their side. They believed that the Holy Lance was a genuine relic, that it would protect them in battle. And their faith gave them the courage to fight, even when the odds were against them. But their faith also led them to commit atrocities, to massacre the population of Antioch, to eat the flesh of their dead comrades. Faith is a powerful force, but it is not always a moral one. Third, leadership matters. The crusade was led by a group of powerful nobles, each with their own ambitions and rivalries. Bohemond, Raymond, and Godfrey were all capable leaders, but they were also deeply divided. Their rivalry almost destroyed the crusade. It was only through the efforts of Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, that the crusaders were held together. Leadership is not just about power, it is about the ability to unite, to inspire, to heal divisions. Fourth, history is full of what-ifs. What if Firouz had not betrayed the city? What if Kerbogha had arrived a few days earlier? What if Stephen of Blois had not deserted, and the Byzantine emperor had come to the Crusaders' aid? The course of history is shaped by countless small decisions, and the Siege of Antioch is a reminder of how fragile the chain of events can be. And finally, the past is not a foreign country. The people of the Siege of Antioch were not so different from us. They loved, they feared, they hoped, they despaired. They made mistakes, they committed atrocities, they showed courage. They were human, and their humanity is what makes their story so compelling. The dream. Now, as you drift off to sleep, think about the Siege of Antioch. Imagine the Crusaders, huddled outside the walls, starving, freezing, desperate. Imagine the defenders, watching from the walls, mocking the Christians below. Imagine the betrayal, the secret negotiations, the dark night when the gates were opened. Imagine the massacre, the streets running with blood, the bodies piled up like firewood. Imagine the desperation of the Crusaders, trapped inside the city, surrounded by Kerbogha's vast army. Imagine the discovery of the Holy Lance, the miraculous relic that gave them hope. Imagine the battle, the impossible victory, the flight of the Muslim army. And then imagine the survivors, the ones who had endured it all. They had seen things that no human being should see. They had done things that no human being should do. They had been changed by their experiences, hardened by their suffering. But they had also been forged into something new, a fighting force that would go on to capture Jerusalem. They were not saints. They were not heroes. They were human beings, flawed and fallible, capable of both great courage and great cruelty. But they were also believers, believers in a cause, in a vision, in a God who had called them to the Holy Land. And they had answered the call. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, in your safe home, surrounded by the people you love, think about the Crusaders. Think about their faith, their endurance, their courage. Think about their mistakes, their failures, their sins. And remember that history is not a story of saints and sinners, it is a story of human beings, doing the best they can, in the worst of circumstances. Sleep well. Sleep deeply. And may your dreams be filled with the sound of bells, the sight of banners, and the hope of a new dawn. Good night.